You hear the stories in the cantinas. They tell you humans are monsters, boogeymen forged in gravity wells that crush normal bones. You nod, drink your ration bear, and think it's just military propaganda. We all did. Then the siege of Koltar happened. I was there in the mud, clutching my rifle, waiting for the end. I saw them drop from the sky. I saw what they did. And I realized the stories weren't exaggerations, they were warnings. Rain fell like dirty needles. It wasn't water, not really. It was a chemical slurry, born from the burning refineries of Outpost Delta, stinging my secondary eyelids and leaving a film of grease on my scales. I wiped the grime away with a trembling, three-fingered hand. The grit smeared across my visor, blurring the ruined landscape into streaks of grey and bruised purple. Beside me, Simon crouched in the trench. His breathing was a wet, ragged rattle. He pressed his hands against the burn on his side, his face a pale, sickly green in the dim light of the flare hanging above us. The air smelled of burnt ozone, sulfur, and the unmistakable sour tang of void rot. We were losing. For 3 weeks, the coalition had held this line against the chitinous swarm. We fought the way civilized species were supposed to fight. We relied on energy shielding, calculated plasma volleys, and geometric defensive grids. It worked for a time, but the swarm didn't care about geometry. They didn't care about attrition rates or acceptable losses. They just kept coming over the ridge, a rolling tide of clicking mandibles and serrated limbs. "Conrad," Simon whispered. His voice barely carried over the low, rhythmic thud of distant artillery. "My rifle. The coil is dead." I looked down. His plasma rifle was caked in a thick, clay-like mud. The cooling vents were clogged. The battery indicator was a flat, lifeless black. I checked my own. 20%. Enough for maybe 10 shots before the overheating safeties kicked in and locked the trigger. "Keep it pointed forward anyway," I told him, trying to keep my voice steady. It wasn't steady. It cracked, betraying the tight knot of panic twisting in my gut. "If they breach the wire, you use the stock." Simon let out a short, bitter laugh that turned into a wet cough. "Right. Bash a Ravager's skull in with 3 pounds of composite plastic. That'll work." I didn't answer. There was no point. We both knew the reality of our situation. Command had gone silent 12 hours ago. The evacuation ships had broken orbit when the swarm spires started launching anti-air spores. We were the rear guard, a polite military term for the abandoned. I leaned my head back against the trench wall. The mud was freezing. It seeped through the thermal lining of my armor, chilling me to the bone. I closed my eyes and listened. Underneath the wind, underneath the hiss of the chemical rain, there was another sound, a vast, terrible rustling. Millions of barbed legs dragging across the jagged rocks of the valley. The clicking of jaws. It sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete, amplified 1,000 times. They were massing for the final push. Fear is a strange thing. It doesn't always make you panic. Sometimes it just makes you tired. My limbs felt heavy, weighed down by gravity and despair. My species, the Veil, were scholars, navigators, diplomats. We joined the coalition for protection, offering our minds in exchange for the safety of their fleets. We were never meant to hold the line in the mud of a dying colony world. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the valley. The flare above us sputtered and died, plunging the trench into absolute darkness. "Conrad," Simon said, his voice tightening. "I hear them." The rustling grew louder. It wasn't distant anymore. It was right outside the wire. The smell hit us before the vanguard did, a suffocating wave of ammonia and rotting meat. I raised my rifle, my finger resting on the trigger. I couldn't see anything. I could only hear the clicking. It was rhythmic, almost musical in its horror. Clack, clack, hiss. Clack, clack, hiss. Then the sky tore open. It wasn't a sound, not really. It was a physical pressure that slammed into my chest and rattled my teeth. The clouds above Koltar didn't just part, they ruptured. A streak of blinding, incandescent orange punched through the gloom, followed by another and another. I squeezed my eyes shut against the sudden glare. The ground shook violently, throwing Simon and me against the muddy walls of the trench. The deafening roar of atmospheric entry drowned out the clicking of the swarm. It was the sound of a mountain being dragged across a metal floor. "What is that?" Simon screamed over the noise, clutching his ears. "Orbital strikes?" I yelled back, hope flaring in my chest. Had command returned? But the impacts weren't explosive. They were heavy, dull, earth-shattering thuds that sent plumes of wet dirt hundreds of feet into the air. They landed right in the middle of no man's land, right in the heart of the massing swarm. 4 distinct craters, glowing with residual heat. The rain hissed violently as it struck the scorch marks, sending clouds of thick, sulphurous steam rolling over the battlefield. Through the vapor, massive rectangular silhouettes stood half buried in the mud. Drop pods. But they were entirely wrong. Coalition pods were sleek, aerodynamic, designed to glide and land with minimal impact. These things were ugly. They were blocky, brutal slabs of scarred metal, scorched black by the heat of entry. They didn't look like vehicles. They looked like coffins built to withstand the apocalypse. A low mechanical hum emanated from the pods. It was a deep, guttural vibration that I felt in my marrow. Then the explosive bolts blew. The heavy steel doors of the pods didn't just open, they were kicked outward with pneumatic violence, slamming into the mud with a wet, heavy thud. I held my breath, peering over the edge of the trench. The swarm had paused. Even the mindless, ravenous chitin seemed confused by the sudden, brutal intrusion. From the darkness of the foremost pod, a figure emerged. It was bipedal, roughly my height, but twice as broad. It didn't wear the sleek, form-fitting energy weave of coalition forces. It wore armor that looked like it had been salvaged from a tank, thick plates of dull green and grey composite, heavily scored and dented. Scratches marred the surface, exposing the raw, silvery metal underneath. It was a human. I had never seen one in person. They were a recent addition to the galactic stage, a species from a high-gravity death world on the outer rim. The rumors said they were primitive, kinetic, entirely too aggressive. The Coalition High Command viewed them with a mixture of disdain and nervous caution. The human stepped down into the mud. The sheer weight of them was obvious in the way the earth yielded beneath their boots. They didn't glide or step lightly. They stomped. With a sharp hiss, the atmospheric seal of their helmet broke, and they reached up, pulling the heavy bucket off their head. It was a female. She had dark hair cropped close to her scalp, her face streaked with sweat and grime. She didn't look majestic. She looked exhausted, annoyed, and profoundly dangerous. She turned her head and spat something onto the ground. It was a casual, visceral gesture that struck me as incredibly strange in the middle of a war zone. "Watson!" she barked, her voice harsh and raspy, carrying easily over the wind. From the second pod, another human stepped out. This one was even larger, his armor bearing the scorch marks of close-range plasma fire. He carried a weapon that made my eyes widen. It wasn't a sleek energy rifle. It was a massive, ungainly tube of black metal, with a heavy box of physical ammunition slung beneath it. "Yeah, Rubina." "I'm here," the second human, Graham Watson, replied. His voice was a deep rumble. He didn't bother taking his helmet off. Instead, he racked the charging handle of his weapon. The sound, a sharp, metallic clack, clack, cut through the tension like a physical blade. "Gravity's about 0.8 standard," Rubina Harding said, rolling her shoulders. Her joints popped loud enough for me to hear. "Feels light. Grounds like soup, though." She reached back into the pod and pulled out her own weapon. It was similar to Watson's, a heavy kinetic assault rifle. There were no glowing battery indicators, no elegant cooling fins. Just cold, dead iron. More humans were emerging from the other pods. A squad of 12. Just 12 of them, standing in the middle of a valley, teeming with thousands of chitinous warriors. "What are they doing?" Simon whimpered from the trench below me. "They're just standing there. They're going to die." I couldn't look away. I watched as Rubina slammed a magazine into her rifle. She didn't give a grand, inspiring speech to her squad. She didn't talk about honor or duty or the glory of the coalition. She just looked at the tree line, where the swarm was beginning to stir again, recovering from the shock of the orbital drop. "All right, boys and girls," Rubina said, her tone utterly conversational. "Command says the bugs have been chewing on our allies for 3 weeks. The vial are dug in about 50 meters behind us." She turned and looked directly at our trench. Even without optics, I felt the weight of her gaze. It wasn't the look of a savior. It was the look of someone assessing a broken tool. "Let's clean up the yard," she said. She put her helmet back on, the visor illuminated with a dull, red glow. The swarm shrieked. A massive ravager, standing 8 feet tall with scythe-like forelimbs, broke from the tree line, charging directly at Rubina. It closed the distance with terrifying speed, its mandibles snapping, throwing up arcs of mud. A coalition soldier would have backpedaled, raising their shield, trying to put distance between themselves and the armor-piercing claws. Rubina didn't move backward. She leaned forward. She raised her rifle and pulled the trigger. The sound was apocalyptic. It wasn't the high-pitched pew of a laser or the crackle of plasma. It was the deafening, percussive roar of controlled explosions. Fire erupted from the barrel of her weapon, a continuous strobe light of violence. The kinetic rounds tore into the ravager. Chitin that could shrug off glancing plasma bolts shattered under the sheer, brute force impact of depleted uranium. The beast's charge was broken, not by a shield, but by the physical displacement of heavy metal ripping through its body. Ichor, thick, green and smelling violently of ammonia, sprayed across the mud. The ravager collapsed, its momentum carrying its twitching corpse to a halt, right at Rubina's boots. She didn't even look down. "Suppressive fire! Advance!" she ordered over the squad comms. 12 humans stepped forward into the dark. Gravity seemed to warp around them. They moved with a relentless, heavy momentum that defied the sucking mud. They weren't elegant. A coalition strike team moves like water, flowing around obstacles, minimizing exposure. The humans moved like a landslide. The swarm hit them like a tidal wave. Hundreds of chitin poured out of the valley, shrieking and clicking, a chaotic mass of limbs and teeth. The noise became a physical wall. The continuous, overlapping roar of the humans' kinetic weapons was deafening. My ears rang, a high-pitched whine settling deep in my skull. I pressed my hands over my audio receptors, watching in absolute shock. The air filled with the smell of burning propellant, copper, and the sharp chemical reek of ruptured alien biology. Empty brass casings rained down around the humans like a golden downpour, hissing as they struck the wet earth. Graham Watson was on the left flank. A group of smaller, faster stalkers tried to outmaneuver him. He didn't pivot gracefully. He slammed his heavy boot into the mud, anchoring himself, and squeezed the trigger of his heavy weapon. The recoil shook his entire frame, driving him backward an inch with every burst. He wasn't aiming with precision. He was carving a path of concussive destruction, literally tearing the ground and the aliens apart. But there were too many. The sheer volume of the swarm began to close the gap. A stalker leaped from a rock outcropping, entirely bypassing Watson's line of fire. It landed squarely on his chest, its serrated claws screeching against his armor. The impact knocked him backward. He hit the ground hard, mud splashing over his visor. I gasped, my grip tightening on my useless rifle. That was it. Once a chitin got inside your guard, you were dead. Their claws were designed to peel armor like fruit. But Watson didn't panic. He didn't try to access a secondary energy weapon or deploy a personal shield. He cursed, loudly. "Get off me, you ugly bastard!" His voice crackled over the open frequency. He didn't use a martial art. He brought his heavy, armored fist up and punched the alien directly in its mandibles. The sound of cracking chitin was sickeningly loud. The stalker reeled, dazed. Watson reached down to his thigh, pulling free a piece of dull, jagged metal. A trench knife. He didn't stab cleanly. He grabbed the alien by the joint of its forelimb, hauled himself upward, and drove the knife into the soft tissue beneath the armor plating. He twisted it, brutally, his breathing heavy and ragged over the comms. The alien thrashed, its claws scraping uselessly across his shoulder pauldron before going limp. Watson shoved the heavy corpse off him. He didn't spring back to his feet. He rolled over, planted one hand in the mud, and pushed himself up, groaning. He looked clumsy. He looked heavy. His armor was covered in thick green ichor and brown mud. He limped slightly, favoring his left leg. He picked up his rifle, wiped a smear of mud off the breech, and started firing again. It was deeply, profoundly disturbing. Coalition doctrine taught that combat was an equation. If your shielding failed, if your weapon died, you were statistically dead. The humans didn't care about the math. When their weapons clicked empty, they didn't fall back to reload. They drew sidearms. When the sidearms emptied, they used knives, entrenching tools, or the heavy stocks of their rifles. I watched Rubina Harding run out of ammunition just as a massive ravager breached her perimeter. The beast swung its scythe. Rubina ducked, the blade shaving a layer of composite off her shoulder armor. She didn't retreat. She stepped inside the creature's guard. She slammed the empty, 10-pound mass of her rifle directly into the creature's sensory clusters. The alien reeled back, shrieking. Rubina dropped the rifle, reached to her belt, and pulled a pin from a small metal canister. She shoved the canister directly into the crack she had just made in the creature's carapace, kicked its knee joint, and threw herself backward into the mud. A dull, muffled thump echoed, followed by a geyser of green fluid and shattered shell. The ravager fell, missing its upper thorax. Rubina scrambled to her feet, spitting a mouthful of mud and blood. She wiped her visor, picked up her rifle, and slammed a fresh magazine into the well. "Keep pushing," she yelled, her voice straining. "Don't let them mass." I realized then, watching them stumble, bleed, curse, and fight with a raw, ugly desperation, why the galaxy feared them. It wasn't because they had superior technology. Their gear was loud, crude, and prone to jamming. It wasn't because they were physically invincible. I could see them taking hits, stumbling, their armor denting and cracking under the pressure. It was because they didn't understand when they were supposed to die. To the humans, violence wasn't a calculated maneuver. It was a chaotic, dirty, intimate struggle for survival. They had crawled out of the mud of their homeworld, fighting gravity, predators, and themselves, and they had brought that primal, unyielding spite to the stars. They fought not with the cold logic of an advanced species, but with the rabid fury of a cornered animal that just happened to figure out how to build spaceships. Beside me, Simon was staring at the battlefield, his mouth open. The fear in his eyes had been replaced by something else. A quiet, horrifying awe. They're winning, he whispered. I looked back at the valley. The chitinous swarm, a force that had relentlessly pushed us back for nearly a month, was faltering. The humans were bleeding them dry, step by agonizing step. The mud was thick with green ichor and empty brass. Rubina Harding paused to reload, her chest heaving. She looked back over her shoulder, directly at our trench. She raised a heavily armored hand and gave a sharp, two-fingered wave. It wasn't a heroic salute. It was a casual acknowledgement of our existence before she turned back to the slaughter. I swallowed hard, the taste of chalk and bitter algae from my ration packs suddenly thick in the back of my throat. I squeezed my rifle. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like prey, but as I watched Graham Watson bash an alien's head in with a rock because he had dropped his knife, I felt a new kind of terror. A cold realization settling into my bones. The coalition had unleashed a monster, and I was just glad it was currently pointing away from me. Silence returned, but it wasn't a peaceful thing. It was a suffocating, heavy pause, choked with the stench of cooked ammonia and burnt propellants. The continuous clicking of the swarm had vanished, replaced by the crackle of dying fires and the wet, heavy breathing of the humans. I slowly lowered my rifle. My hands were shaking so badly, I could hear the composite stock rattling against my armor. Beside me, Simon was curled into a tight ball, his secondary eyelids clamped shut, murmuring a veiled prayer of safe passage. Down in the valley, the humans were moving. They didn't strike triumphant poses over the mounds of shattered chitin. They slumped. Rubina Harding leaned heavily against the charred husk of a ravager, her rifle dangling loosely from its tactical sling. She reached up, punched a release valve on her helmet, and pulled it off again. Steam poured off her head in the frigid air. Her face was pale, smeared with grease and alien fluids. She looked utterly drained. Graham Watson limped toward her, his left leg dragging slightly in the thick mud. He didn't look like a legendary warrior. He looked like an exhausted laborer at the end of a grueling shift. He collapsed onto a flat rock jutting from the mire, letting his massive, heavy weapon hit the dirt with a wet thud. "Check your ammo," Rubina rasped, her voice cracking. She coughed, spitting a thick wad of phlegm into the mud. "Sound off. Who's broke?" The comms crackled. Voices, strained and tired, began to report in. "Down to 2 mags, boss," a voice replied. "My left servo is jammed. Can't lift my arm above my shoulder. Suit seal compromised on my thigh, getting cold." They sounded entirely ordinary, brittle even. I watched, fascinated and horrified, as Watson pulled a small silver roll from his utility belt. It wasn't some high-tech nano-sealant or energy field generator. It was physical tape. He wrapped it tightly around a deep gouge in his thigh armor, tearing it with his teeth. "Idiots," he muttered under his breath, though it carried through the quiet air. "Command drops us in a swamp, a literal swamp. My knees are going to rust before the bugs kill me." Rubina ignored him. She trudged up the incline toward our trench, her boots squelching with every heavy step. She stopped at the edge of the wire, looking down at Simon and me. Her eyes were bloodshot, framed by dark, bruised circles. "You the Vale rear guard?" she asked. There was no formality in her tone, no coalition protocols. I swallowed hard, forcing my vocal cords to work. "Yes, I am Conrad. This is Simon. We held the line." Rubina looked at the meager defensive perimeter, our dead weapons, and the sheer volume of corpses littering the valley below. A cynical, tired smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Sure you did, buddy," she said, her tone dry but surprisingly lacking in malice. She reached into a pouch on her chest rig and tossed a small, rectangular object down into the trench. It hit the mud near my knee. Eat that. Tastes like cardboard, but it'll keep you from shaking apart. I picked it up. It was a foil-wrapped human ration bar. It felt dense, heavy as a lead weight. Your command abandoned you, Rubina stated flatly, looking out over the horizon. Ours told us to plug the gap. Seems we both got the short end of the stick. You came to save us? Simon asked, his voice trembling as he finally uncurled, looking up at the towering human female. Rubina laughed. It was a harsh, barking sound that held no joy. Save you? Kid, we're expendable. High Command didn't want to risk the valuable mechanized divisions in this weather, so they dropped the apes. We aren't here to save you. We're here to break the swarm's staging ground so the brass can pretend they won a tactical victory. She turned, pointing a dirty, armored finger toward the jagged mountains in the north. There's a spire up there, a localized spawning node. That's what's been feeding this endless wave. We're going to march up there and put a hole in it. I stared at her, my mind struggling to process the sheer absurdity of the plan. March? Through the valley. It is a 5-kilometer trek. The terrain is hostile. The swarm will regroup. You only have 12. I stopped myself, looking at the squad. You only have 11 effectives now. One of the humans was sitting on the ground, a medic binding a severe laceration on their arm with crude physical staples. Yeah, well, math was never our strong suit, Rubina said. She slammed her helmet back onto her head. The visor snapped shut, hiding her tired eyes behind a layer of unreadable, dull red glass. You two can stay here in this hole and wait for the scavengers, or you can fall in behind us. Your call. She didn't wait for an answer. She turned her back on us and began walking down the slope, signaling her squad. Simon looked at me, terror warring with desperation in his wide black eyes. Conrad, what do we do? I looked at my dead rifle. I looked at the dark, roiling clouds above, offering no hope of rescue. And then I looked at the humans, slowly forming up in a loose, sloppy column in the mud. They were complaining. I could hear them over the open comms, griping about the cold, the smell, and the lack of orbital support. They were flawed, fragile, and utterly miserable. We follow the apes, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Walking behind a human squad is an exercise in sensory overload. Coalition troops move in silence, utilizing acoustic dampeners and stealth webbing. The humans made no such effort. Their heavy armor whined and clicked with every step. Their boots, caked in inches of grey clay, tore at the ground with brutal, tearing sounds. They breathed loudly over the comms, an ongoing symphony of grunts, coughs, and cynical banter. "Hey, Watson," a human named Davis called out from the vanguard. "If I get eaten by a giant cockroach today, tell my ex-wife I died owing her money. If you get eaten, Davis, I'm looting your corpse for that pack of real tobacco you've been hiding," Watson rumbled back, his heavy weapon swaying rhythmically with his limp. Priorities. It was jarring. We were walking into a meat grinder, stepping over the dismembered, leaking corpses of alien horrors, and they were talking about debts and dried leaves. It felt profoundly disrespectful to the severity of the situation, yet, looking closer, I saw the tension in their shoulders. I saw how their weapons were always leveled, how their heads constantly swiveled on a swivel. The banter wasn't relaxation. It was a pressure valve, a psychological trick to keep from screaming. The rain picked up, turning the valley floor into a treacherous soup. Every step required effort, dragging the mud up with us. Simon was panting heavily, his lighter veil physiology struggling to cope with the treacherous footing. I kept a hand on his shoulder, physically pulling him along. We had covered 3 kilometers when the ground betrayed us. There was no warning screech, no massing charge over a ridge. The ambush came from below. The mud directly beneath Davis erupted. A burrower, a specialized armored variant of the swarm designed for subterranean ambushes, exploded upward. Its jaws, built to crush bedrock, clamped shut around Davis's waist. The sheer kinetic force of the impact threw the human into the air like a rag doll. Davis screamed, a ragged, terrified sound that cut through the comms. The burrower tried to drag him back down into the sinkhole it had created. A Vale unit would have fallen back, calculated the probability of rescue, and likely deemed it a net negative. The humans didn't calculate. They reacted with immediate, disorganized fury. "Contact center column!" Rubina roared. She didn't shoot. The burrower was using Davis as a meat shield. Instead, Rubina dropped her rifle into the mud, drew a heavy, brutalist sidearm, and sprinted directly at the sinkhole. Watson was already there. He had dropped his heavy weapon and was physically gripping Davis's armored harness, planting his boots into the slick mud, playing a grotesque game of tug-of-war with a 3-ton alien insect. "Pull, damn it, pull!" Watson roared, his helmet off, the veins in his neck bulging against the strain. The servos in his armor whined, a high-pitched scream of metal pushed past its tolerances. Rubina reached the edge of the pit. She didn't hesitate. She shoved her arm directly into the burrower's snapping mandibles, jamming the barrel of her sidearm against one of its recessed, gelatinous eyes. She emptied the magazine. 6 deafening cracks echoed in rapid succession. The burrower shrieked, a sound that vibrated in my teeth. Black, viscous fluid erupted from its eye socket. Its jaws went slack. Watson hauled backward, his momentum sending both him and Davis tumbling into the mud. The squad didn't pause to celebrate. The ground around us began to boil. More burrowers were breaching the surface. "Square up! Overlapping arcs!" Rubina yelled, kicking the dead burrower's twitching leg back into the hole and retrieving her rifle. Combat resumed, but it was nothing like the defensive stand at the trench. This was close, messy, and claustrophobic. The air filled with flying mud, shattered chitin, and the sharp, coppery tang of human blood. I dragged Simon behind a jagged rock, watching the chaos unfold. It was not a ballet of war. It was a bar brawl. A human named Sarah, the medic, was knocked onto her back by a glancing blow from a burrower's tail. The creature reared up to crush her. Sarah didn't block. She rolled violently to the side, letting the heavy tail smash into the mud where her head had just been. As the creature struggled to free its appendage from the suction of the earth, Sarah shoved an explosive charge directly underneath its thorax and scrambled away on her hands and knees like a feral animal. The explosion showered us in hot mud and alien gore. I looked over at Davis. He was lying in the center of the formation, clutching his waist. His armor was compromised, the composite plates cracked and driven inward. Blood, brilliant and unnervingly red, was pooling in the grey mud beneath him. Sarah, covered in grime and ichor, slid to a halt beside him. She ripped off her gauntlets with her teeth, exposing bare, pale skin to the chemical rain. She didn't use a sterile energy scalpel or a biofoam applicator. She pulled a crude metallic tool from her kit. She dug her bare fingers into the wound to clear the shattered armor fragments. Davis screamed, thrashing in the mud. "Hold him down!" Sarah barked. Watson, having recovered his heavy weapon, pinned Davis's shoulders with his boot while firing a continuous burst into the advancing swarm. "Stop being a baby, Davis. You're ruining my aim." Sarah pressed the metallic tool against Davis's torn flesh. Clack, clack, clack. She was stapling him. She was physically driving metal staples into his flesh to close the wound. It was the most barbaric, primitive medical procedure I had ever witnessed. It defied every standard of galactic hygiene and trauma care. But the bleeding stopped. Sarah slapped a thick, adhesive bandage over the staples, grabbed Davis by the harness, and hauled him to his feet. "You're fine!" she yelled over the gunfire. "Walk it off!" Davis, pale, gasping, and visibly trembling, picked up his weapon. He didn't protest. He didn't ask for a medical evacuation. He leaned heavily on his uninjured side and began firing again. I stared at them from behind my rock, my mind failing to reconcile what I was seeing. They were so fragile. Their bodies bled from minor impacts. Their armor broke. Their weapons jammed. They felt pain. They felt fear. I could hear it in their ragged breathing and their panicked shouts. Yet they refused to stop. A coalition soldier fought until their equipment failed, and then they accepted defeat as a logical outcome. The humans treated equipment failure, physical injury, and impossible odds as mere inconveniences. They possessed a terrifying, irrational stubbornness that logic couldn't defeat. "We are close," Rubina's voice cracked over the comms, breathless and strained. "Through this line. The spire is just over the ridge." The squad pushed forward. They didn't glide. They limped. They bled. They cursed the rain, the mud, and the galaxy that had put them here. And as they carved a path through the unending swarm of nightmare creatures, using nothing but kinetic force and sheer, spiteful willpower, I finally understood. The galaxy didn't fear humans because they were perfect killing machines. The galaxy feared them because they were broken, imperfect, fragile things that simply refused to die. The incline was a brutal, jagged spine of volcanic rock and hardened alien resin. The chemical rain had turned to a freezing sleet that coated the slope in a layer of treacherous, grey ice. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. My lungs burned. Vial physiology is adapted to the sterile, climate-controlled environments of orbital habitats and university arcologies. The air here was thin, laced with sulfur and the ubiquitous, rotting meat stench of the swarm. I was gasping, my three-fingered hands bleeding inside my gauntlets as I clawed at the jagged rocks to pull myself upward. Simon was doing worse. He had stopped talking an hour ago. His pale green skin had taken on an ashen, translucent quality, and a thin line of blue fluid leaked from the corner of his mouth. He collapsed against a boulder, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. "I cannot," Simon wheezed, his eyes rolling back slightly. "Conrad, leave me. Statistically, it is the only viable parameter." He was right. Vial military doctrine dictated that wounded units reducing overall mobility by more than 30% were to be abandoned to preserve the core group. It was cold, mathematical survival. I looked up the slope. The humans were 20 meters ahead, a line of dull grey and green armor moving through the sleet. They were exhausted. I could see it in the way their shoulders slumped, the way they dragged their feet. I reached down to grab Simon's harness, fully intending to leave him, just dragging him to a slightly more sheltered alcove so his end would be out of the wind. A heavy, armored hand clamped onto my shoulder, shoving me aside. It was Graham Watson. He had fallen back from the vanguard, his massive frame looming over us. He didn't have his heavy kinetic weapon anymore. He had discarded it a kilometer back when the firing pin sheared in half, leaving a multi-thousand credit piece of military hardware rusting in the mud. Now he carried a heavy, pump-action combat shotgun, a weapon so primitive it belonged in a museum, not on a battlefield. "Get up, Green Bean," Watson grunted, his voice a low, mechanical rumble through his external speakers. "His internal temperature is dropping," I said, trying to push Watson's hand away. "His respiratory system is failing. He is a liability." Watson didn't look at me. He leaned down, grabbed Simon by the thickest part of his combat harness, and hoisted him into the air with a terrifying display of raw physical power. He draped Simon over his massive armored shoulder like a sack of synthetic grain. "I didn't ask for a medical readout," Watson snarled, adjusting his grip on his shotgun with his free hand. "Nobody dies on the side of a hill. It's bad luck." He turned and began trudging back up the slope, carrying a fully grown vial and 50 pounds of combat gear on a leg that was already leaking hydraulic fluid and blood. I stared after him, completely bewildered. It defied all logic. Simon was not a human. He was not a member of their squad. He was dead weight. Carrying him exponentially increased Watson's risk of slipping, of exhausting his already depleted stamina, of dying. But as I scrambled up the ice-slick rock behind them, I noticed something else. The other humans didn't complain. Davis, still leaning heavily to one side from his stapled waist wound, merely shifted his firing arc to cover Watson's exposed flank. Rubina Harding glanced back, saw the veil slung over her heavy gunner's shoulder, and simply nodded once before turning back to the storm. They packed together. When the environment pushed against them, they didn't shed their weak links to move faster. They closed ranks. They absorbed the burden. We crested the ridge an hour later, the sleet finally breaking to reveal the source of the nightmare. The spire. It wasn't a building. It was a biological extrusion, a massive, twisting tower of hardened black chitin and pulsating organic resin. It reached hundreds of feet into the bruised purple sky, anchored to the bedrock by thick, fleshy tendrils that throbbed with a slow, nauseating rhythm. The ground around it was entirely covered in a carpet of moving, clicking horrors. The swarm's rear guard, well, Rubina said over the comms, crouching behind a ridge of basalt. She sounded like she had been gargling glass. "That's a lot of bugs." "Surgical strike, boss?" asked a human named Hayes. He was methodically wiping ice from the optic of his rifle. Rubina let out a short, tired exhale that might have been a laugh. "Sure. We're going to take a surgical sledgehammer and smash it right into the surgeon's face. Davis, Sarah, set up a crossfire on the left flank. Watson, keep the shotgun fed. We're going right through the front door." "Front door?" I asked, crawling up beside her. I pointed a trembling finger at the base of the spire. "There is no door. It is a solid wall of biological armor, and there are at least 400 heavily armored variants between us and the base." Rubina reached into a bulky satchel at her hip. She pulled out 3 blocks of a pale, clay-like substance. She began kneading them together, her armored thumbs pressing crude detonators into the soft explosive. "Conrad, right?" Rubina asked, not looking at me. "Yes." "You ever see what high-yield plastic explosives do in a confined space?" "No. Keep your mouth open when it blows, or the overpressure will rupture your eardrums." She stood up, tossing the massive brick of explosives to Hayes. "Breach formation. Move!" They didn't sneak. They didn't try to find a flanking route. The remaining humans stood up, crested the ridge, and began walking directly down the slope into the teeth of a 400-strong defensive line. They fired from the shoulder. It was a slow, rhythmic, punishing advance. The sharp cracks of their rifles cut through the clicking of the swarm. Every time a human weapon barked, an alien body ruptured. They weren't missing. Despite the exhaustion, despite the cold, their aim was mechanically precise. The swarm charged, a wave of scythe limbs and armored heads. "Hold," Rubina ordered calmly. The wave closed to 50 meters, 30, 20. The smell of ammonia was suffocating. Now, Hayes didn't throw the explosive. He sprinted forward, a lone figure breaking formation, sliding through the freezing mud. He shoved the massive brick of clay directly into the open, snapping jaws of a leading Praetorian, a beast the size of an armored transport, and threw himself backward into a shallow crater. The blast was physical. It didn't just make a sound. It sucked the air out of my lungs and punched me in the chest. A blinding flash of white light vaporized the sleet, followed by a shower of superheated gore, shattered chitin, and black ash. The front of the swarm's defensive line simply ceased to exist. The shockwave tore through the beasts behind them, shattering their legs and rupturing their internal organs. Through the raining meat and smoke, the humans marched forward. They stepped over the twitching, ruined bodies, their boots crunching on broken shells. They didn't hesitate. They didn't check to see if the blast had killed everything. They just walked into the smoke, their weapons raised, moving relentlessly toward the biological nightmare of the spire. The entrance to the spire was a ragged, bleeding hole torn open by the kinetic force of the explosion. The thick, chitinous armor of the structure had been shattered, exposing the soft, pulsating pink and grey flesh beneath. It smelled like a slaughterhouse left to rot in the summer sun, a thick, cloying mixture of copper, bile, and ammonia that instantly triggered my gag reflex. "Flashlights!" Rubina barked as she stepped over the threshold into the humid darkness. A series of harsh, blindingly white beams cut through the gloom. The humans didn't possess low-light optical implants or sophisticated thermal overlays. They simply strapped high-intensity halogens to the barrels of their weapons. The beams jerked and swayed with their movements, casting long, frantic shadows against the bioorganic walls. The contrast between the freezing sleet outside and the sweltering acidic heat inside was dizzying. The air was thick with spores that stuck to my visor like wet dust. Watson stepped in behind Rubina, carefully lowering Simon from his shoulder and propping him against a relatively dry patch of the fleshy wall. He checked the veil's pulse with two thick, dirty fingers, then racked the slide of his shotgun. The heavy metallic clack-clack echoed unnaturally in the squishy, sound-dampening corridor. "Tight formation," Rubina ordered, her beam sweeping the ribbed, tunnel-like ceiling. "Watch the vents. If it looks like a hole, assume a bug is going to come out of it." I stood near Simon, my dead plasma rifle clutched in my hands like a useless club. I was terrified. The Veil are not claustrophobic by nature, but this place was fundamentally wrong. The walls were expanding and contracting, breathing in a slow, wet rhythm. The floor was spongy, coated in a slick, clear lubricant that made every step treacherous. We moved deeper. The tunnel sloped downward, spiraling into the earth beneath the spire. The silence was worse than the battle outside. Outside, you could track the enemy by the noise. In here, the sounds were muffled. The dripping of fluids, the squelch of human boots, the heavy, strained breathing of the squad over the comms. "Motion trackers are useless," Hayes muttered. "The walls are moving. The floor is moving. Everything is a contact." "Use your eyes, Hayes," Rubina snapped. "Stop looking at the screen." The ambush didn't come from the front. It came from the ceiling. A massive section of the fleshy roof suddenly tore open, raining acidic slime and shattered membrane down onto the squad. 3 stalkers dropped directly into the center of our formation. In the tight confines of the tunnel, the humans' rifles were suddenly too long, too unwieldy. A stalker landed squarely on Sarah, the medic. The impact drove her to her knees, the creature's mandibles snapping inches from her faceplate. She didn't try to bring her rifle to bear. She let it drop on its sling, her hands flying to her belt. She drew a thick, serrated combat knife, grabbed the alien by the sensory antennae with her left hand, and drove the blade up under its armored chin with her right. The creature thrashed wildly, its scythe legs gouging deep rents into the heavy composite plates of her chest armor. Sarah didn't let go. She twisted the knife, dragging it sideways with a guttural scream of pure exertion, virtually decapitating the beast in a shower of thick green blood. Simultaneously, Watson stepped forward, The second stalker lunged at him. Watson didn't aim. He leveled the heavy shotgun from his hip and pulled the trigger. The thunderclap of the 12-gauge in the enclosed tunnel was deafening. I felt the shockwave in my teeth. A cloud of heavy buckshot struck the alien mid-leap, physically arresting its momentum and shredding its thorax. The creature hit the fleshy floor as a ruined, twitching mass. The third stalker locked eyes with me. I froze. I was a scholar. I had undergone basic coalition defensive training, which consisted entirely of falling back behind an energy shield and waiting for automated turrets to engage. I had no shield. I had no turrets. The beast coiled its legs, its mandibles vibrating with a high-pitched hiss. I didn't think. The human madness, the relentless, irrational instinct for survival that I had been witnessing for the past 4 hours, suddenly overrode my veil conditioning. I didn't run. I stepped forward. I gripped the barrel of my dead plasma rifle with both hands, raised the heavy 3-pound composite stock above my head, and swung it like a bat just as the stalker lunged. The stock connected with the side of the creature's head with a sickening, hollow crack. The impact jarred my arms up to the shoulders, sending a spike of sharp pain through my collarbone. The stalker was knocked off course, crashing into the squishy wall beside me. Before it could recover, Davis was there. He limped forward, pressed the barrel of his rifle directly against the creature's exposed joint, and fired a 3-round burst. The tunnel fell quiet again, save for the ringing in my ears and the harsh, ragged breathing of the squad. I stood there, staring at the dented stock of my rifle, my chest heaving. My 3-fingered hands were stained with green ichor. I was trembling, but it wasn't from fear. It was an adrenaline spike so potent it felt like liquid fire in my veins. Rubina walked over to me. Her armor was a mess of gouges, scorch marks, and alien blood. Her visor was cracked, a jagged spiderweb of lines obscuring her left eye. She looked at the dead stalker, then looked at me, her flashlight beam blinding me for a split second before she angled it down. "Not bad, Green Bean," she said softly, reaching out to slap my shoulder pauldron. It was a rough, careless gesture, but it felt like an initiation. "Keep your feet under you. We're almost at the core." She turned away, reloading her weapon in the dark by pure muscle memory. I looked back at Simon. He was awake, his dark eyes wide, having witnessed the entire exchange. He looked at me as if I were a stranger. Perhaps I was. The civilized, calculating Vale scholar had died in the mud outside. What was left was something rougher, something infected by the grim, stubborn violence of the bipedal apes, leading us into the dark. "Move up," Rubina commanded, her voice echoing down the fleshy throat of the spire. We stepped over the corpses and marched deeper into the heat. The tunnel widened, the fleshy walls giving way to a cavernous, spherical chamber. The heat here was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest and clouding my visor with condensation. It didn't smell like rot anymore. It smelled like raw, unbridled biology, a sickeningly sweet aroma of amniotic fluid and birth. This was the spawning node. Thousands of translucent leathery sacs hung from the ceiling and clung to the walls, each one glowing with a faint, bioluminescent pulse. Inside, curled silhouettes twitched and shivered. In the center of the room, a massive column of grey, ribbed nerve tissue stretched from floor to ceiling, acting as the central processing unit for the entire localized swarm. It was guarded. They didn't look like the drones outside. These were royal guards. 3 of them. They were pale, almost white, with armor plates so thick they looked like walking geological formations. They didn't click or hiss. They waited in absolute, terrifying silence. "Well," Rubina breathed over the comms. Her voice was barely a whisper. "That's a problem." "I have 3 shells left," Watson stated flatly, breaking open his shotgun to check the breech. "Davis? 1 mag, maybe a dozen loose rounds." Davis coughed, his face pale underneath his cracked visor. The staples in his side were leaking red into the white bio-lubricant coating the floor. Rubina looked at the central nerve column, then at the brick of plastic explosive still clutched in her hand. "We don't need to kill them. We just need to break that pillar. Hayes, Sarah, take the left one. Davis, cover the right. Watson, you and me are going straight up the middle." She didn't give an inspiring speech. She didn't wait for acknowledgement. She just broke into a heavy, plodding sprint. The cavern erupted into chaos. The Royal Guards moved with a speed that belied their massive bulk. The one on the left intercepted Hayes before he could raise his rifle. A scythe-like limb, pale and deadly, cleaved through the air. Hayes threw himself backward, firing wildly, the kinetic round sparking and ricocheting harmlessly off the creature's armor. In the center, Watson didn't try to dodge. He stepped directly into the path of the largest guard, planted his good leg, and fired his shotgun point-blank into the creature's knee joint. The armor cracked, but it didn't shatter. The beast barely flinched. It backhanded Watson with a massive bladed forearm. The impact sounded like a car crash. Watson was thrown through the air, crashing into a cluster of egg sacs. He hit the ground hard, his shotgun skittering away into the dark. He didn't get up immediately. His armor was caved in across the chest, and a harsh, wet rattling came over his open comm channel. "Watson!" Sarah screamed, abandoning her firing position to run toward him. "Leave him!" Rubina roared. She was using Watson's distraction. She sprinted past the staggered beast, aiming directly for the central nerve column. The third guard intercepted her. It brought both of its heavy claws down in a crushing arc. Rubina slid on her knees through the slime, the claws slamming into the floor right behind her. She came up fast, driving her rifle barrel into the creature's exposed joint and pulling the trigger until the weapon simply clicked empty. The creature roared, its limb mangled, but it swept its other claw horizontally. It caught Rubina in the shoulder. She spun violently, hitting the ground and dropping the explosive charge. The brick of clay slid across the slick floor, stopping 5 feet from the base of the nerve column. Rubina tried to push herself up, but her left arm hung at a sickening angle. Her shoulder armor was completely crushed. The guard loomed over her, raising its scythe for the killing blow. I don't know what possessed me. I was a vial. "We do not do this." I dropped my dead plasma rifle, sprinted across the slippery floor, and threw myself onto the explosive. I grabbed the cold, heavy clay, scrambled onto my hands and knees, and scrambled toward the column. "Conrad! Get out of there!" Rubina screamed. I reached the fleshy grey pillar. I jammed the explosive into a deep crevice in the tissue, my 3-fingered hands shaking uncontrollably. I found the crude, mechanical timer Rubina had embedded in the clay. I twisted it. A harsh, red light blinked to life. A high-pitched, rhythmic beep echoed in the chamber. The Royal Guard holding Rubina froze, its sensory clusters fixating on the sudden noise. It dropped her and turned toward me, letting out a deafening, furious shriek. 60 seconds, I screamed, my voice cracking, terrified out of my mind. The retreat was not a tactical withdrawal. It was a panicked, desperate scramble. "Run!" Rubina barked, dragging herself to her feet with her one good arm. Sarah had reached Watson. She was hauling the massive man up by his combat harness, straining under his sheer weight. "He's alive! Help me!" Davis limped over, shoving his empty rifle into its sling. Together, the 2 wounded humans dragged their heavier, battered comrade toward the tunnel exit. I ran back to Simon. He was exactly where I had left him, staring blankly at the chaos. I grabbed him by the harness. I didn't think about his weight, or my own fatigue, or the Veil protocols regarding acceptable losses. I just pulled. We hit the tunnel just as the royal guards realized they couldn't disarm the explosive. Their shrieks turned from anger to pure, unadulterated panic. They began tearing at the nerve column, trying to rip the infected section out. The climb back up was a nightmare. The fleshy floor was slick with slime and the blood of the aliens we had killed on the way down. My lungs were burning, screaming for oxygen in the thick, suffocating heat. Every beep of the timer echoed in my skull, counting down to our absolute destruction. "Keep moving! Don't look back!" Rubina yelled from behind us. She was providing rearguard cover, holding a simple trench knife in her good hand, ready to fight anything that followed us up the throat of the spire. We saw the grey, bruised light of Koltar's sky ahead, the ragged hole we had blown in the entrance. 30 seconds, Davis wheezed, his face a mask of agony as he and Sarah dragged Watson over the lip of the tunnel and out into the freezing sleet. I pushed Simon out ahead of me, scrambling over the jagged, broken chitin of the entrance. The freezing air hit my lungs like a physical blow, shocking me out of the adrenaline haze. We didn't stop. We couldn't. We threw ourselves down the icy slope, sliding, tumbling, and scraping against the volcanic rock. 10! Rubina's voice cracked over the comms. She emerged from the hole, sprinting down the incline, her boots slipping on the ice. "Get down. Cover your seals." I grabbed Simon and threw us both into a shallow depression behind a large basalt boulder. I curled into a tight ball, pressing my hands over my audio receptors, closing my secondary eyelids tight. The explosion was not a sound. It was an absence of sound. For a fraction of a second, the universe simply went deaf. Then, the ground beneath me heaved violently, throwing me several inches into the air. The shockwave rolled over us, a tidal wave of concussive force and superheated air. The sky turned a blinding, pure white. Debris rained down like artillery. Chunks of biological matter, shattered chitin, and heavy stone slammed into the ground around us, shaking the earth with dull, heavy thuds. A massive piece of the spire's outer shell smashed into our boulder, showering us in razor-sharp fragments. And then, the horrible, wet tearing sound. I opened my eyes. The massive, twisting tower of the spire was leaning. The explosion hadn't just destroyed the core, it had severed the anchor tendons. Slowly, agonizingly, the structure collapsed inward, folding in on itself before crashing down into the valley below in a massive, churning cloud of black smoke and green vapor. Silence rushed back in. It wasn't the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of a graveyard. The localized swarm network was dead. Down in the valley, the remaining drones stopped moving with purposeful coordination. They twitched, disoriented and feral, snapping at each other before scattering into the wasteland. I sat up slowly. My whole body ached. Every joint felt like it had been packed with crushed glass. A few meters away, Rubina pushed herself up from the mud. Her armor was completely ruined, the chest plate cracked and exposed. Her left arm hung uselessly at her side. Her face was streaked with blood, grime, and sweat. She reached into a small compartment on her belt with a trembling hand and pulled out a single, crushed, slightly damp cigarette. She placed it between her lips, striking a crude chemical match against her leg armor to light it. She took a deep drag, exhaling a thin cloud of grey smoke into the freezing rain. Watson was sitting against a rock, coughing up blood, while Sarah wrapped a thick layer of physical tape around his shattered chest plate. Davis was lying flat on his back in the mud, staring up at the grey sky, laughing, a weak, hysterical, broken sound. They were a mess. They were loud, crude, fragile, and utterly ruined. They had walked into a meat grinder with nothing but kinetic metal and raw, unadulterated spite, and they had broken it. Rubina looked over at me. She didn't smile, but she gave me that same slow, acknowledging nod. "Good hustle, Green Bean," she croaked, a small trail of smoke escaping her lips. I looked at my hands, still stained with the ichor of a nightmare, and then at the burning ruins of the spire. The galaxy tells stories about humans. They say they are monsters, born of high gravity and endless conflict. They say you should fear them because they are apex predators. But the stories are wrong. You don't fear a human because they are a perfect soldier. You fear them because when you strip away their shields, when you break their weapons, when you push them into the mud and tell them it's mathematically impossible to survive, they will just spit blood in your eye, pull a knife, and drag you down into the dark with them. And I have never been more grateful to share a trench with monsters. The human spirit isn't about perfection. It's about raw, unyielding spite in the face of impossible odds. The Coalition learned that the hard way on Koltar, and the Swarm learned it at the barrel of a kinetic rifle. If you enjoyed this dive into the gritty, unbreakable nature of humanity, don't leave this trench just yet. Hit that like button, share this story with your fellow survivors, and subscribe to the channel for more epic, grounded HFY sci-fi tales. We've got plenty more dropships inbound, and you won't want to miss the next deployment. Stay frosty.